Picture this. It's July 2025. The House Foreign Affairs Committee is in full swing, reviewing a bill called the U.S.-South Africa Bilateral Relations Review Act of 2025. Sounds dry, right? Well, not this time. What was supposed to be a typical markup turned into fireworks when two very different voices, Republican Brian Mast from Florida and Democrat Jonathan Jackson from Illinois, clashed over one of the most controversial narratives floating around American politics today, so-called white genocide in South Africa. Now, before you roll your eyes and think this is just another political shouting match, hang tight, because what went down says a lot about how the U.S. sees South Africa, and it exposes the messy way politics, ideology, and global relations collide. So here's the setup. This bill, H.R. 2633, is all about reviewing America's relationship with South Africa. It talks sanctions, human rights concerns, and whether South Africa's cozy ties with Russia, China, and even its genocide case against Israel should change the way Washington treats Pretoria. Already a hot topic. But then Representative Brian Mast added fuel to the fire. Mast leaned into a narrative that has long been popular with right-wing groups in the U.S., especially since Donald Trump's presidency. He raised the issue of attacks on white South African farmers, especially Afrikaners, and suggested this amounted to a campaign of violence so severe it could be called genocide. If you've heard that phrase before, you'll know it's been circulating for years. Attached to claims about farm murders and land expropriation policies like South Africa's Expropriation Act, which allows redistribution of land to correct apartheid-era injustices. Here's the kicker, though. Jonathan Jackson wasn't having any of it. He jumped in and flatly rejected Mast's claims, saying this so-called white genocide narrative is not only false, but also dangerous. Jackson described it as nothing more than extreme MAGA ideology, dressed up as foreign policy. And he had data on his side. Let's break it down. According to South Africa's own official statistics from 2024, there were 19,696 murders nationwide. Out of those, 36 happened on farms. That's 36 too many, yes. But calling that genocide? That doesn't even come close to the United Nations definition, which requires intent to wipe out a group, in whole or in part. Even South African farming groups like AgriSA and Afrikaner organizations like Solidarity have distanced themselves from the genocide label. And multiple South African leaders, along with international media, have said the same thing. Farm attacks are brutal, tragic, and part of the country's wider violent crime problem, but they are not evidence of a racial extermination campaign. Jackson made exactly that point, warning that this kind of rhetoric risks undoing decades of diplomatic progress between the U.S. and South Africa. Instead of focusing on shared values and reconciliation, he argued, the U.S. would be throwing fuel on the fire of conspiracy theories. But Mast wasn't budging. He doubled down, tying his concerns not just to the farmers, but also to South Africa's foreign policy moves, its case against Israel at the International Court of Justice, its trade ties with Russia and China. In Mast's view, all of this painted South Africa as a bad actor, one that the U.S. should punish with sanctions. And here's where things get really interesting. While Mast's camp sees South Africa as drifting into dangerous territory geopolitically, Jackson's camp sees this bill as a hammer trying to solve a problem that needs a scalpel. He argued the legislation oversimplifies South Africa's very complex history, especially around land, race, and reconciliation since the end of apartheid. So what happened in the end? The bill passed the committee. The vote was 34-16, with 28 Republicans and 6 Democrats backing it. That means it's now on its way to the full House for consideration. Now let's step back and talk about why this matters beyond Capitol Hill drama. The debate reveals two competing narratives. On one side, the fear-driven idea that white South Africans are under threat of genocide, which simply isn't backed up by the facts. On the other side, the push to acknowledge South Africa's real problems. Yes, violent crime is high. Yes, land reform is contentious, without distorting them into something they're not. It also shows how U.S. politics uses foreign issues as proxies for domestic battles. When Mast invokes white genocide, it resonates with a certain slice of American voters who see South Africa as a cautionary tale about race and land redistribution. When Jackson calls that out, he's not just defending South Africa, He's defending a more fact-based, less sensational approach to diplomacy. And the irony? Even Afrikaner groups themselves, the very people who would supposedly be at the heart of this so-called genocide, are saying, no, that's not what's happening here. Meanwhile, South Africans of all races are more worried about the general crime rate, unemployment, and corruption than about being caught in an ethnic cleansing campaign. So next time you hear someone throw around the phrase, white genocide in South Africa, remember this exchange. It's not just about statistics, it's about how narratives are shaped, politicized, and used to justify bigger moves like sanctions or shifts in foreign alliances. In other words, what happened in that committee room wasn't just a heated argument. It was a snapshot of how the U.S. wrestles with fact versus ideology, fear versus reality, and diplomacy versus domestic politics. And trust me, this is only the beginning. With the bill moving to the full House, the white genocide debate is going to keep popping up in political speeches, media debates, and maybe even presidential talking points. Whether it changes U.S.-South Africa relations? That's the real question we'll be watching. So what do you think? Is the U.S. overreacting to South Africa's policies, or is this a justified move to hold a partner accountable? Either way, this shows just how messy global politics can get once you mix in ideology, history, and a whole lot of emotion. That's it for today. Thanks for watching, and stick around because this story isn't over.
Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 2633, the U.S. South Africa Bilateral Relations Review Act of 2025. The bill was circulated in advance, and the clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 2633, to require a full review of the bilateral relationship between the United States and South Africa and identify South African government officials and ANC leaders eligible for the imposition of sanctions and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with, and the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. And I now recognize myself in support of the bill. I want to voice my strong support for H.R. 2633, the U.S.-South Africa Bilateral Relations Review Act, and U.S. interests. Even more alarming has been South Africa's posture following the October 7th Hamas attacks on Israel. The ANC's refusal to acknowledge those atrocities, its direct engagement with Hamas leadership, and its politicized case against Israel at the ICJ reflects a government that has turned away from principle and from its traditional role as a bridge between the global South and democratic norms. South Africa or any nation cannot conduct themselves in such a manner and expect the same quality of relationship with the United States of America. H.R. 2633 requires the administration to provide clarity. It mandates a full, comprehensive review of bilateral relationship between our two countries. It requires the President to certify whether South Africa has engaged in activities undermining the United States, national security, or foreign policy interests, and requires a classified report identifying South African individuals eligible for sanctions based on corruption or human rights abuses. These are practical, measured steps to ensure our policy reflects our values. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, not to sever ties with South Africa, but to reset the expectations that we have. We owe it to the American people and to the South African people to take these concerns seriously, and I thank you all for hearing my remarks. Does the ranking member have any comments? Ranking member is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. South Africa acts as a leader, not only among African countries, but also on the world stage. As we have seen this year with the country's G20 presidency, we have a long history of partnership between our countries that I hope to see continue in the future, including with a successful handover as the United States assumes the G20 presidency next year. Unfortunately, this bill will not help to deepen or further that partnership. Instead, I believe it sets us down the wrong path with respect to our relationship if he chooses. He doesn't need this legislation to do it. And let's be honest, President Trump has already disproportionately targeted South Africa. He's done this by trying to embarrass President Ramaphosa in the Oval Office with faulty evidence of purported atrocities in the country, by instituting an executive order cutting all U.S. assistance to the country and putting it in a place where special refugee resettlement programs for Afrikaners. And at the same time, he's blocking the resettlement of literally all other refugees to the United States. Refugees fleeing genocide in Sudan, not allowed. Refugees fleeing Russian bombardments in Ukraine, not allowed. Refugees fleeing political persecution in Venezuela, not allowed. This is glaring hypocrisy, and I do not believe Congress should further enable or double down on President Trump's misguided approach. When we disagree with our partners, including on the continent of Africa, we should handle that responsibly by using diplomacy and presenting convincing arguments. Unfortunately, this bill fails to do that. So I strongly oppose this legislation and urge all of us to look for future opportunities to steer the United States-South Africa relations in a more productive direction. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Is there any further discussion? Representative Jackson is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Which Jackson, sir?
Ronnie Jackson.
The senior Jackson.
The one I was looking. I thought I made eye contact with the one I wanted, but next time
Yes, sir.
I'll make it more clear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this important markup today and allowing us for swift consideration of my bill, the South Africa Bilateral Relations Review Act. For decades, South Africa has enjoyed a rich partnership with the United States, particularly in terms of trade, counterterrorism cooperation, and global health. Recently, however, South Africa has abandoned America and our allies and increasingly aligned itself with our adversaries like China, Russia, Iran, and Iranian military proxies like Hamas. South Africa also hosts Confucius Institutes, cooperates with PRC's Belt and Road Initiative, conducts military exercises with China and Russia, and is involved in efforts to degrade the U.S. dollar in the global monetary system. If strengthening ties with our adversaries wasn't enough, South Africa is systematically going after our partners and allies, downgrading Taiwan's presence in the country, falsely accusing the State of Israel of genocide at the illegitimate International Criminal Court, and mimicking Iran's disgusting dismissal of the atrocities committed by Hamas on October the 7th. Domestically, extreme politicians from the African National Congress, or ANC, have led efforts to target Afrikaners. These actions cannot go unanswered. South Africa and the ANC must be held accountable, and it is imperative that we reevaluate our bilateral relationship to ensure it still aligns with our strategic national security objectives. My bill, the U.S.-South Africa Bilateral Relations Review Act, will provide the President and the Secretary of State with the tools needed to conduct a full review of the U.S.-South Africa bilateral relationship and determine whether South Africa has engaged in activities that undermine United States national security or foreign policy interest. In addition, my bill will give the Trump administration the authorities needed to identify and sanction corrupt officials of the ANC and continue to align with China, Iran, Russia, and have abandoned the United States in the process. President Trump has already shown tremendous leadership on this issue, eliminating aid or assistance to South Africa and working to help resettle persecuted farmers outside of South Africa. The U.S.-South Africa Bilateral Relations Review Act will expand on the President's efforts to hold bad actors accountable while promoting our national security and supporting our partners and our allies. I encourage every member of this committee to support my legislation, and with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Any further discussion?
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Jacobs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. While I too have expressed concerns with South Africa's engagement with Russia, I do not agree with this bill's approach. As the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Africa, I hear constantly from leaders in the Global South that they do not want to be forced to choose between the U.S. and Russia or the U.S. and the PRC. One incredibly successful program of the United States in South Africa is AGOA, which has created jobs and strengthened U.S. soft power in the country, which we know is critical given the economic challenges everyday South Africans face. However, this administration has completely undermined this long-standing bipartisan program's implementation through its slapping of 10% tariffs on all countries and has threatened to increase the tariffs even more. Continuing to undermine this law would be a mistake, including cutting off South Africa's eligibility. I think it's important that we do not punish everyday South Africans for actions of their government that some of us may disagree with. The certification section of this bill also duplicates an existing annual review under the AGOA Act and is unnecessary. The U.S. government already has a process to consider all of these factors and determine AGOA eligibility. I oppose this bill, and I urge my colleagues to do the same.
I yield myself such time as I may consume 5 minutes. I rise in strong support of the legislation. I want to thank Dr. Jackson for this bill. I think it's long overdue. Thank you for it. I do wish to highlight one provision of the bill which identifies the Chinese Communist Party's ongoing efforts to bully Taiwan and to pressure the South African government into downgrading Taiwan's representative office and move it from Pretoria to Johannesburg. The unrelenting pressure that the CCP wages against Taiwan on multiple fronts is part of a broader strategy to wear down and conquer the frontline democratic partner of the United States. Indeed, tomorrow, on July 23rd, the Congressional Executive Commission on China, which I co-chair, will be holding a hearing entitled Stand with Taiwan, Countering the PRC's Political Warfare and Transnational Repression. The CCP's actions in South Africa is yet another front in this larger campaign against Taiwan. I would note with deep concern that on July 18th, South African Deputy President Paul Mashatile concluded a visit to China, and then yesterday, South Africa's Department of International Relations and Cooperation, or DIRCO, issued a statement containing retroactive references with regards to the Taipei Liaison Office in the Republic of South Africa, the officially mutually agreed upon name of Taiwan's representative office. To the government of South Africa, I wish to reiterate that the United States Congress is viewing this very closely, and that any changes from what has been the status quo would be viewed very negatively. It's a core concern, U.S. concern, that democratic countries do not acquiesce and cower to the demands of the Chinese Communist Party. Let's not forget, the Chinese Communist Party is a dictatorship run by Xi Jinping, who is committing genocide as we meet in this hearing or today against the Uyghurs, the Muslim Uyghurs, and a myriad of human rights abuses are committed each and every day by that Chinese Communist Party. We are also watching this very closely because it impacts South Africa's trustworthiness as a partner. South Africa signed an agreement with Taiwan in 1997 by which it agreed to let Taiwan have a representative office in Pretoria, with its diplomats accorded certain rank and privileges. Any unilateral attempt to break this agreement would be unacceptable. I want to commend the Democratic Alliance, which is a member of the Government of National Unity, in its effort to stand up for the democratic Taiwan and push back against the pro-CCP actors in the government who seek to acquiesce to Chinese demands. And to the extent that the African National Congress is seeking to silence the Democratic Alliance reformist voice in the ongoing national dialogue currently underway, this too has now gotten the attention of the U.S. Congress. It is my hope that Taiwan and South Africa can return to the status quo, which was legally binding by their agreement, and that they reject any pressure by the Chinese Communist Party. Is there any further discussion? Mr. Jackson.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Meeks, I rise today in strong opposition to H.R. 2633, the U.S. House South African Bilateral Relations Review Act of 2025. This resolution does absolutely nothing to advance our bilateral relations with South Africa, and in fact, threatens to undermine it at a time when strengthening its relationship is crucial. This bill proposes a full review of our relationship with South Africa, and must I say, it's less than 30 years old before there was a segregated, apartheid-backed South African government that the United States was on the wrong side of the people of South Africa. This bill proposes a full review of our relationship, as long as is the focus on the South African government and ANC leaders for potential sanctions. This is not diplomacy, this is coercion. And it's based on a deeply flawed premise that ignores the complexities and international relationships and significant strides we've made together. Yes, we have differences with South Africa, particularly concerning the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the Israel-Hamas conflict. But let's be honest, South Africa's position on these conflicts is no different than some of our own allies. Are we questioning our relationship with our other allies that are Europeans? No, we continue to engage them through dialogue, seeking to win them over. Why should South Africa be treated any differently? This bill even South Africa's stance on the Israeli-Hamas conflict, accusing Israel of genocide. Yet, about 14 countries, including EU and NATO allies alike, like Spain, Italy, Ireland, are supporting South Africa's decision to file a suit in the International Criminal Court of Justice. Are we sanctioning Ireland, Spain, and Italy? The hypocrisy is glaring. Furthermore, let's not forget that President Trump himself went further than South Africa, falsely blaming Ukraine for starting the war and even accusing President Zelensky, calling President Zelensky a dictator without elections, according to the AP. This bill seeks to punish South Africa for positions, in some cases, that echo the sentiment even from within our own government or are shared by our closest allies. South Africa regards this bilateral relationship with the United States as founded on mutual respect and shared values for democracy and liberty. They are open and willing to deepen and expand cooperation through robust engagement. President Ramaphosa has recently dispatched cabinet members to Washington, D.C. for working visits, and meeting requests are being submitted to members of Congress from both sides of the aisle. The effort to reset strained relations are already underway. Congress must also allow diplomacy to play a central role in resolving political differences based on principles of international law, mutual respect for sovereignty. Such engagements will build upon our recent meetings with President Trump and President Ramaphosa. Consider our economic ties. South Africa is our largest U.S. trading partner in Africa, with a total of two-way trade that consumes over $20.5 billion in 2024. Over 600 U.S. American businesses are set up in South Africa and are being very prosperous. South Africa is a strategic partner, a strong democracy, a global voice committed to human rights. We collaborate on shared global policies, health, climate, trade, investment, education, and digital economy. Addressing challenges through mutual respect and respectful dialogues will yield enormous returns for Africa, where we have vital national security interests. The proposed H.R. 2633 will only lead to further tension and undermine the progress that's already being achieved. We cannot convince South Africa that international law doesn't matter and that only the United States law truly matters. This is not leadership, this is arrogance. I must say, as we sit here in these marbled walls of Congress and talk about a democracy, we've had less than a 30-year relationship with South Africa. This is a sovereign nation that chooses to have an independent point of view. They have suffered the most. We have been on the wrong side of exploiting them. The only people that have experienced a genocide and a dispossession of their land in South Africans have been the blacks in South Africa. There is no credibility, no truth to saying that white South Africans have experienced genocide. Those were manufactured pictures. We should have a level of humility, a level of decency, a level of integrity to stand up for what is right. South Africans have not been guilty of white genocide. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Anyone else wishing to be heard? Yes, Mrs. Jayapal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I oppose this bill. It appears to be, in large part, an attempt to punish the South African government for its advocacy for the Palestinian people at the International Court of Justice. This is particularly offensive given that Black South Africans are intimately familiar with the oppressive structures of apartheid and land expropriation. It is outrageous and horrifying to see what is happening in Gaza and the West Bank to the Palestinian people. For over a year and a half, the government of Israel has repeatedly used weapons, including many supplied by the United States, to kill people in Gaza indiscriminately, in violation of both our U.S. laws and our international humanitarian laws. In Gaza, the reported death toll has now surpassed 58,000 people, and tens of thousands more have been injured. Hundreds of thousands of homes, buildings, schools, hospitals, and religious sites have been destroyed or damaged, even when it is unnecessary to achieve Israel's stated military goals. 2 million Gazans face prolonged food shortages as the Israeli government uses hunger as a weapon of war. This is, to use Pope Leo's word, barbaric. Palestinians must make an impossible choice: starve or risk being shot while trying desperately to reach food. There is no place that is safe in Gaza, not even churches or other places that should be sanctuaries. I have repeatedly condemned Hamas's terror attacks on October 7th that killed 1,200 people, and I also immediately called for a release of all hostages. But it is unfortunately becoming clear that Netanyahu is not prioritizing the safety of the hostages and has no interest in securing a peace deal. Nor is the Israeli government's intent even simply to dismantle Hamas. Prime Minister Netanyahu and top Knesset leaders have made repeated comments that disgustingly dehumanize Palestinians, calling for Palestinians to be forcibly relocated. In fact, even the Trump administration has grown alarmed at Netanyahu's behavior, with an administration official reportedly saying Netanyahu is acting, quote, like a madman after his recent strikes on Syria. South Africa's case in front of the International Court of Justice deserves to be fairly evaluated without political pressure. If one is so convinced that this is not a genocide, why not then allow the ICJ to investigate and assess the evidence? Instead, Republicans are now using the same playbook they use in the United States to attack the court and launch outrageous attacks against South Africa to try and discredit their claims. This began with claims of a supposed genocide against white Afrikaner farmers, where even the photo that President Trump showed during these theatrics was from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, a country that is over 1,000 miles away from South Africa. And if he cared about facts, he would know that a crime report from the South African Police Service shows that only 0.1% of murders in the country have been directed towards farmers. And despite Black South Africans representing 80% of South Africa's population, they only own 4% of all farms and agricultural lands, a result of the legacy of colonial and apartheid rule that lasted until the early 1990s. Trump then made a mockery of our refugee system by granting refugee status to 59 white Afrikaners who were fleeing fabricated persecution. This group even included an individual who had published anti-Semitic claims that, quote, Jews are an untrustworthy and a dangerous group, end quote, despite statements from Secretary Rubio that our immigration policy should be based on, quote, the national interest of the United States. The hostility towards Black South Africans and opposition to the African National Congress, partly expressed by my Republican colleagues, is not unfortunately new. Nelson Mandela, who was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize for his leadership in the anti-apartheid movement, was considered a terrorist by the United States government for his activism, and he remained on the terror watch list until 2008. Since then, the United States has worked hard to deepen our strategic, political, and trade relations with South Africa. But now we are once again jeopardizing that progress. These claims of a supposed white genocide, combined with this administration's cozying up to dictators like Putin and Bolsonaro, damage not only progress, but America's credibility. I urge my colleagues to oppose this bill, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Anyone else asking to be heard? If not, there's no further discussion on the bill. The committee will move to consideration of amendments. Does any member